There we go. Okay, I'll hand over to you then, Ray.
Lovely. Thank you, Steph, and good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming along tonight. As Steph mentioned, yeah, I'm ex-museum person, so just to explain a little bit, I've always been interested in natural history and insects throughout my life, and when I was at senior school and the careers advisor came along and said, what do you want to do? I said, well, I'm working nature conservation. So you might wonder why I ended up with lots of dead animals in a museum. And the reason is that to study insects properly, you do need to actually look at insects under a microscope. So museums, of course, have got fantastic collections. Bristol Museum's got a wonderful collection of insects. So you can use the information there to actually inform and help conservation policies. So Bristol Museum has basically 200 years of information on its specimens of how insects have been changing around Bristol over that time. So that's a little bit of an explanation of why museums are actually relevant to to conservation and wildlife gardening. And today I'm talking about encouraging and identifying pollinators, and I'm going to cut the talk into two halves. So the first half is really going to be a little bit about what pollination actually is, why it's important, which animals pollinate and why, the role of nectar as opposed to pollen, and a little bit about how insects and plants have been co-evolving. Then we'll have a quick break, and then the second half will be a closer look at bees, and then how are our pollinators faring and what can we all do to try and improve their situation and therefore improve the situation for us. So that's the plan. So if everyone's happy, I will start my little presentation, if I can share the screen with you. And hopefully you can see that now.
Yes.
Lovely, great, thanks. So, and Stefan, now I can't see the chat, so people have to jump in and if there's questions.
Okay.
So we'll do that way. Okay, so to start off with, if the slide's going to change. There we go. So why are pollinators important? And I'm sure some of you are very familiar with these sorts of statements that you can find easily across the web. You've probably heard it said before that this is a statement at the top from the United States Department of Agriculture, that without pollinators, the human race and all of Earth's terrestrial ecosystems would not survive. And of 1,400 crop plants around the world, about 80% require pollination by animals. And it's, again, you probably have seen suggestions that where pollinators have declined in some parts of the world, this has already been happening, well, we'll have to introduce methods of replacing them. And one of those is to actually, at bottom left-hand picture, physically people to pick up pollen on brushes and pass it on to other flowers by hand. Or even on the right there, they've been developing these sort of robot bees. And as you can see, I think this is all frankly ridiculous. It's absolutely crazy to try and think of artificial ways to pollinate plants when we should just be doing much, much more to protect the pollinators that we have that do such an efficient job. Whatever we create will be much, much less efficient. And it's an economic issue as well, of course. So this slide here comes from the Urban Pollinators Project, which was a scheme back in 2012, so a long time ago now, which put money into several cities, including Bristol and Bristol University, to investigate about different environments within the urban environment and see what were the best places for pollinators to live. Surprise, surprise, gardens and allotments come out top in the urban environment, but economically there, the value of crops 10 years ago, pollinated by insects, £510 million per year, goodness knows what it is now. And then they were estimating that to replace that with hand pollination would cost £1.8 billion. So it's crazy to think that we should do anything other than do more to preserve our pollinators. And those are the sort of human reasons for protecting pollinators. But of course, we have a responsibility in looking after the wildlife outside there just in its own right to protect the forms of life that are part of the ecosystem that we all live in. So we should be thinking per se about preserving pollinators, full stop. They are part of natural food webs, regardless of whether they're pollinating our crops or not. So if we want to protect those pollinators, we need to understand what pollination actually is, which creatures are doing it, and how it takes place. And the first thing to pick up on is exactly what is pollen, I suppose. And it seems always so strange to talk about plants and sex, but this is what we are talking about. The pollen is the male sex cell. And just on the right there, you can see a schematic idea of what a typical pollen cell would look like. And around the outside, that dark green, is the outer covering. And on top of that outer covering, there are lots of proteins attached to it. And it's actually the proteins that cause our hay fever. So we breathe in the pollen grains that are in the air, and we react sometimes adversely to the particular proteins that might be being carried on those pollen grains. And that's why we suffer from hay fever if you're allergic to those particular proteins. The different pollen cells from different plants are all sorts of shapes and sizes, absolutely amazing. So the middle image is a microscope photograph of different pollen cells. And as I'm sure many of you know, you can use those to identify which particular plants have been in an environment. If, say, you go down onto the Somerset levels, pull out some of the peat and get it under a microscope in this way, you can tell which plants were around when the peat was formed by looking at the pollen grains, which are preserved well because of this hard external shell, if you like, to the pollen grains. So that's what a pollen grain is. And pollination is not just pollination by animals. We should make the distinction, of course, that pollination is not actually the sex act, if you like, in plants. It's the transfer of the male gamete to the female. So pollination is just the transfer of the pollen to the female part of the plant. And we immediately think about all the different flowering plants that we have and how pollinators move pollen across from one to another. But we should remember that wind pollination is also very important. And in fact, the reason we get hay fever is because the first spring hay fever is usually due to tree pollen. Here's some examples of tree pollen being wafted away. Just a piece of one piece of statistic: one birch catkin can produce 5.5 million pollen grains, just one birch catkin. So it's no wonder that we're breathing them in the spring, and some of us get hay fever as a consequence. And then later in the summer, our grasses are wind pollinated, and our cereal crops down there on the left are pollinated by wind. And again, that's when you get the second peak of hay fever. So it's due to wind pollination. But there's also pollination by water, and this can happen with flowering plants in both the marine and the freshwater environment. So the pollen will be produced and be in the water and move across from one plant to another, carried by water. So there are other examples of pollination other than the ones that we typically think about. But to come back to terrestrial pollination, the thing we usually have in front of our heads. So here we have two identical lily flowers. If you've ever had cut lilies in your house and brushed against them, you'll know how staining the pollen is off these lilies. But that's by the by. This is really just to emphasize again what the process is of pollination. So if you take the left-hand flower, I hope you can see my cursor. So don't worry about all these different names, but basically the flower has this stalk called a filament. On top is the anther, and that is where the pollen grains are produced. And they have to be transported, whether it's by wind or, in this case, we'd hope by an insect, over to land on the female part of the flower, which is a stalk called a style and a stigma at the top. And when the pollen grain lands on the top of the stigma, it then grows a tube all the way down with the style and reaches the ovary at the base of the flower, where the female gamete is, and the two can combine and therefore create your fertile seed. So that's all that's happening really, and there are various strategies involved by both the plants and insects to make this happen in the best way for the different species involved. And it's been going on an awful long time. So insects go right back into the Carboniferous period, and flowering plants have been around a long time as well, back to the Jurassic period, time of the dinosaurs. And they expanded hugely in the Cretaceous period. And then we have things like magnolias, which some of you may actually have in your gardens today. 95 million years ago, there were magnolias, and they were some of the first examples of insect pollination taking place. And ever since then, insects and the plants have been co-evolving and creating all these amazing interactions. So in the UK, most pollinators are insects. If you go to the tropics, then there are birds and bats who will be very important pollinators too. But in terms of animal pollination in this country, it's primarily through insects. And there are these four main reasons why insects will be visiting flowers. So the first will be to eat pollen grains. They're not altruistic. They're not thinking about, oh, I must pollinate this flower so there'll be more flowers next year. They are there to get nourishment. And so the first reason is eat the pollen grains, which have these proteins in them, so they can be very nutritious for the insects. The second is that as well as the pollen being produced on the anthers, many plants and flowers produce nectar from little glands called nectaries. And usually they're at the base of the flower, and as you know, that's sort of a sugary sap. I'm still surprised sometimes how many people get confused about pollen and nectar. They're two very different things. But insects will be visiting flowers either for one or the other, or both, as in you can combine these two things together. The third main reason you might visit a flower as an insect is that there are other insects there to eat that are actually feeding on the pollen or the nectar. So it's a ready meal, if you like. You might catch them and eat them straight away, or you might lay your eggs on them, or want to parasitize them in some way. So you will hover around these plants, land on these plants. You might actually eat some pollen grains or sip some nectar yourself, but the reason you're there is primarily probably to prey on these other insects. And the final reason is to collect the nectar or the pollen or both and use it elsewhere. This is what we usually think of with bumblebees, for example, and honeybees collecting pollen nectar and taking it back to a nest somewhere else. But they are, and you know, not every reason is just to go and take stuff back to your nest. So any insect that's landing on these flowers and plants is therefore likely to be acting as a pollinator by coincidentally moving from flower to flower and transferring pollen from the anthers over to the female part of the style and stigma. So just to run through some of the different types of insects and what they're doing on plants. So as I said, there are pollen eaters, and that means that they're insects that have little biting mouth parts and they can actually get hold of the pollen grains and eat them. I don't know if people are familiar with thrips or thunderflies, as I always call them. They're certainly not as common as they used to be, but I remember as a teenager cycling past cereal fields where I lived and the heat of the summer and getting covered in these tiny little black insects, because they're often found around cereal grains where they'll suck out the insides of the pollen grains, eating them. But they'll also be on other plants, and actually they can be really quite important pollinators of some of our crops like onions and things. So vegetable crops can be pollinated by these little thrips, funny little, you can see how small they are by that pencil, and there's one in front of that pencil nib. And then there are beetles very often on flowers. If you go out into the woods at the moment, for example, or even up on the Bristol Downs, and look in the yellow flowers, the buttercups, it's quite likely you'll see at the moment quite little brown beetles. And they're like the one at the bottom left here, they're pollen beetles. And the one at the moment that's very common is the thing called the raspberry beetle. And that has these biting mouth parts. And you can have half a dozen in one buttercup head, all chewing away on the pollen grains, and therefore also getting coated with pollen and also transferring pollen around from flower to flower. In the middle, click beetles are noted because they can make a little click and jump up in the air to escape predators. And they can be found on flowers, particularly this time of year on the hawthorn, the May blossom. If you're a gardener, they might not be your friend because they're grubs. Their larvae are wireworms. So you might not like wireworms, but actually the adult beetles they turn into are quite important pollinators of flowers as well. And then at the bottom right, there's a longhorn beetle there, black and yellow one. They've not quite appeared yet this year. They're more high summer species. But if you go up into Lee Woods, when the bramble is in flower, you'll probably quite easily find these big longhorn beetles on the flowers. And all of these are eating pollen grains, all of them acting as pollinators as a consequence. And you might be surprised to learn that there are some moths which are also pollen eaters. And these top two in this slide here, the Micropteryx tumbagella, as it's called, it's only about 3 or 4 milliliters long. It's a beautiful little thing, as you can see, with this gold and purple colours. And if you want to see that, if you go to a tree that's in flower at the moment and tap the branches, there's a good chance it'll fall out, because these they use the term primitive. They're not really primitive, but they haven't changed much in evolutionary time. So these types of moths have not developed the proboscis that you see in butterflies, a long straw-like tube. They still have, like their predecessors did, the primitive insects, little biting mouth parts. So they actually eat pollen grains, these tiny moths. And the ones on the right are in the same group of moths, these little Micropteryx calthella. And again, if you go out now and look in buttercup flowers, let's say on the downs, you've a good chance of finding them all sitting in there. And that's what they are doing. They're eating pollen grains, and they are also therefore acting as pollinators. And other insects as well. So the really beautiful little wasps, ruby-tailed wasps, like the one at the bottom here, they're actually parasites of other bees, but they do feed up on the protein from pollen by visiting flowers and eating the pollen grains before they go off and do their nasty business. And at the moment, you should see lots of hoverflies about as well, which are really important pollinators. We all think about bees as the most important pollinators, but actually they're only part of the story. And hoverflies are really important, many of them being wasp mimics, as you can see in all these pictures here. So the one on the left, Surface ribesi, is quite a big hoverfly and looks a bit like a small wasp. The ones on the right, slightly smaller, the marmalade hoverfly, and another one at the bottom. These marmalade hoverflies sometimes arrive in the UK from Europe in vast clouds, which, because they're so small, we don't notice, but they do migrate to this country most years, and they do a really important job. And all of the ones shown here are eating pollen grains. And flies like this, they don't actually necessarily like being coated in pollen. So this particular slide shows a fly, and it's got a special technique of cleaning its self of pollen by running its forelegs through its mouth parts to get rid of them. So it's not always what the plant wants that's happening here. And you've got all these different beetles and moths and flies visiting these flowers. So here are some of the types of predators and what we call parasitoids that visit the flowers to try and catch these other insects. So the common wasps, German wasp, Norwegian wasp, they're all fairly common. They will visit flowers at this time of year to catch other insects because they're carnivorous. And as accidentally, therefore, will be also getting coated in pollen and acting as pollinators. And the strange-looking fly on the left-hand side, they're called parasitoids rather than parasites. A parasitoid is an insect that actually, in this case, lays an egg on a shield bug, and the grub will kill its host eventually. So that's why it's a parasitoid, not just a parasite, because it ends up killing the host. It's an amazing fly. Again, you can find these very close to us up in Lee Woods in the summer. This species, the parasitic fly, can be seen up here. So nothing rare in these pictures I'm showing you. And some of our hoverflies are able to feed on both the nectar and the pollen. So it will depend on the shape of the flower as to which they can reach and whether they can reach all the nectaries. But basically, these ones have a long enough extendable mouth part to be able to reach the nectary and get the nectar, as well as the pollen on the top of the flower. So don't worry about the Latin names, but just a few examples of hoverflies, which are not specializing on pollen or nectar. They're able to use both. And here's a picture of those mouth parts of these flies. Many, many flies have these suctorial mouth parts. So they basically regurgitate a little bit of fluid onto the flower and then suck up that fluid again with either the nectar or the pollen or both absorbed into it. So that's how they get their nutrient. And amazing as insects are, so their legs actually have these means of tasting what they're landing on. So they can actually have sensors. They have sensors in their legs, which mean that they know if they're landing on a nice flower full of pollen-rich things for them to eat. And don't be scared by this slide. I'm not going to talk about any chemistry, but I did want to just talk a little bit about nectar, because again, I think that you can, there's a sort of level of understanding pollination, which is an easy sort of top level. Whenever you start to dig into it, you find it's much more complicated, and you can leave it at the top level, or you can dig in a bit further and find out what's going on. There's lots of information out there to help you. So the composition of nectar, everybody probably knows that it's basically a sugary solution of water. It's basically the sap from the plant being excreted out through these little glands, specifically to attract insects. They're not always in flowers, actually. Some of them, if you have cherry laurel, and then you might find you get insects like bees visiting the base of the leaves because they have nectaries there where they produce sugary nectar. And they're doing that because they're not attracting pollinators, they're trying to attract ants to protect their plant from other creatures eating their leaves. And then the bees come along and rob the nectar. But nectar varies hugely from plant to plant. Its composition can change during the day, it can change over the season. And here's just some examples that the amount of different sugar in the nectar, it can be different types. So sucrose is basically cane sugar that we put in our cups of tea, but glucose and fructose combine together actually to make sucrose. And different flowers will have different proportions of these different types of sugars. And as you can see there, it says that sugars will be between 15 to 75% by weight. So a huge variation in whether they're very rich in sugar or actually quite weak. And if you look at the writing on the left-hand side, when the nectar is deep in a flower, they tend to be rich in sucrose, cane sugar type sugar. When they're shallower in the flower, so insects without long tongues can reach them, they tend to have the glucose and fructose sugars. If they're in very high concentrations, like the 75%, by weight, then they're likely to be aimed at bees, whereas low sugar nectars much more favoured by things like butterflies and moths. And as well as sugar and water, there are amino acids, the building blocks of proteins in nectar. And so again, there's variation in how concentrated those amino acids are. And again, they are tailored to different groups of insects. So it's really quite amazingly complex. So now to something a bit more familiar, perhaps, is the butterflies and moths we might see feeding at flowers with their long proboscis. So you're probably familiar with the butterfly bush, Buddleia, and here's a small tortoiseshell butterfly nectaring on the little tubes of that flower. The hummingbird hawk moth is a lovely moth that visits us from North Africa and Southern Europe every year. There's been several reported in Bristol already this year, hovering during the day at flowers like this lovely long proboscis, so it can take the nectar. And you might wonder, how's it pollinating if it's just sticking its tube down to get the nectar? But they will get covered in pollen as well, both on the proboscis and also on themselves at times. And a little bit more rarer is a day-flying thing called the narrow-bordered bee hawk. So you'd need to go down to places like Blagdon Lake to try and find that lovely bee-mimicking moth. Looks very much like a bee, but again hovers at flowers, taking the nectar and acting as a pollinator. What's been discovered very recently is that people have been not rating enough how important nocturnal pollination is as well. Because we're mostly not watching it, we've perhaps ignored it a little bit. But of course, plants like night flowering stock, they smell beautifully in the evening. And the reason they're doing that is to attract the nocturnal insects that are out there that can act as pollinators. And so our moth populations are really important pollinators. In fact, some of them are specialists for pollinating some of our rarer wildflowers as well. So cultivating night-scented stock, night-scented flowers is really nice to encourage more pollinators to visit your garden. These are common species. The silver Y moth is another migrant that comes here from Northern Africa and Southern Europe. Very common moth, and you often see it in the day as well as at night, with its wings vibrating very rapidly. And of course, they've had these millions of years of evolution that's been going on, where the plant is trying to use insects to carry its pollen from one to another. And the extreme example of how this sort of co-evolution has been taking place is this famous example that Charles Darwin, was sent a specimen of this orchid from Madagascar. And he predicted that it had this hugely long flower. There must be a moth with a hugely long proboscis that can actually get to the nectar and act as the pollinator for this particular plant, and its only pollinator as a consequence. And it was actually Alfred Russel Wallace who later on discovered the moth that did this. And yes, there is this moth which has about a 30-centimetre long proboscis, would you believe, and is the only pollinator of this plant. So they've evolved together amazingly. So not a local example, but it does just show you how intertwined insects and plants and flowers are. So I mentioned about flies having these suctorial mouth parts, but some of them don't. Some of them have tubes a bit like the proboscis on a butterfly. And this spring, probably many of you will have seen the little bee flies buzzing around our gardens and allotments, like this dark-edged bee fly. This is the commonest species. And it looks like they're hovering at flowers, but actually they're usually resting their legs. They're cheating a bit on the plant. They are absorbing nectar, but also things like mosquitoes. We all know mosquitoes bite us, but it's only the female mosquito that bites. Male mosquitoes, like this one here, they just want to mate with the females, but they need some energy to do that. So they actually visit flowers and are pollinators. There is a positive story to tell about mosquitoes for once.
Ray, we've had a couple of questions. Is it a good time to ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you might come on to this later, but if someone sees a bee, butterfly or moth that seems to be struggling and exhausted, what should we do? There's various ways of talking about making sugar water for them. What concentration should that be? And should we be putting them in the shade, near water or inside a flower? Or what's your suggestion?
Yes, how to be an insect vet, basically. You can try and mix up just some normal sugar in water, just make it really concentrated. If you then get, say, a piece of cotton wool and soak it in the water, the saturated water, and then they should be able to, if you just get them to sit on the cotton wool, they should be able to taste it through their legs, and then they should start to feed if they need it. Some people would say get a little tiny pin and try and unroll, say, their proboscis so it touches the cotton wool, but they should actually work it out. Sometimes you find these bees and they're a bit incapacitated because they've got a bit drunk on some of the concentrations of things that they're drinking. So just putting them out of the way in the shade so they don't get trodden on is the best thing sometimes as well. But there can be lots of reasons why these things look exhausted. It could be that they've actually been parasitized as well. So some of the parasites that lay eggs on these insects, then the grubs themselves will control the behavior of the bees or whatever it is, and make them do different things that benefit the parasite rather than the insect and the host. So it could be that as well. So you can try, but actually there's not a huge amount probably you can do to help them. It's best put them in the shade so they're not boiling and hope they recover.
Thank you. Mo was asking, you mentioned reporting sighting of insects in Bristol. How is this done? And is it possible to see reports? I've mentioned Bristol Environmental Record Centre, but is there anything more you want to say? Or could you tell people how they can report their sightings to Brooke?
Yes, the easiest thing is just to go on their website and you can actually just submit records and sightings through their website. Or if you want to, you can post sightings in the old-fashioned way to their location in Henbury, which is, again, the address is on their website. What we have these days is lots of different Facebook groups which are there helping people to identify things that they've seen in their gardens and a lot of places. So just with a mobile phone camera, if you can take a snap and then share it with all sorts of different Facebook groups, there's lots around Bristol, specifically around Bristol. I'm a member of loads of them, to be honest. There's national ones. So there are national Facebook groups for identifying spiders, bees, wasps, ants, butterflies, moths, and people are usually really helpful in trying to give you a name for it. Or you can use a purpose-built app. So there are apps like iNaturalist and iRecord, where they will actually help you identify what it is from the photograph through their clever technology. And then you can submit the record actually through that app called iRecord. It will actually send it nationally, and then it will come back to the local record centre as well. So there's lots of ways to do it. Hope that helps.
Thank you. You might come on to this later as well, but apart from night-scented stock, what other plants attract moths?
Well, things like buddleia do as well, actually. So that the common ones that you grow in your garden for day flying pollinators also work at night. But anything like jasmine and things that really smells lovely in the evening, the reason it's doing that is not for our benefit. It's for the insects to be attracted. So anything that smells good in the night. So if you go to a garden centre and just look for anything that's night scented, then that's bound to be a good one, I'd have thought.
What are the go-to best plants for daytime pollinators? And same question for night pollination. Sorry, I'd not read this one before I started. What plants are covering the widest variety of pollinators? Ooh, good one.
I've got some suggestions further on, which I'll come on
Okay.
to about plants, but like anything, if you can create a mosaic, then you'll be offering lots of different things for different insects and different pollinators. So best to have a variety of all sorts of things and to think about what's going to be providing lovely pollen and nectar at different times of the year. But I've got some advice about that whole thing a little bit further on in the second half. So I'll come back to that.
It's similar to what Sean was saying last week about the tapestry. He was talking about flowering lawns and not just having one type, but lots of different types of flowers and grasses is the best thing to do.
It is, and people either hate or love no mow May, but you don't have to just let the whole lawn go. Actually, you can trim little paths through it, and so it looks a bit more purposeful. And actually, that will help as well. So you don't have to just have a jungle.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ray.
Okay, I'll move on a little bit further, and then we'll have a break in 5 or so minutes. So these are some of the hoverflies you'll see in your garden or allotment, which are specialising just on drinking nectar. These are really common. So these are the drain flies. So I'm sure everybody has probably seen these hoverflies in your garden or allotment that are hovering about 6 or 7 feet up in the air, and then darting away and coming back to the same place. And they are honeybee mimics. But because they're true flies, they're hoverflies, they only have 2 wings, 1 pair of wings, whereas honeybees would have 4 wings, 2 pairs of wings. But they're great mimics. But they have these huge eyes, and the ones you see hovering in your garden, they're the males who are looking out for females to dive on top of. But they're great pollinators again. So their grubs are rat-tailed maggots. So if you have a water butt and you don't like water butts because they've got mosquito larvae in and they've got these strange rat-tail things in, the rat-tailed maggots turn into these wonderful hoverflies. So do leave a space for those if you can. So this final part of this first half really is about how do plants attract pollinators to them. Again, well, don't worry about the figures or anything. The point that's being made really of this slide is that this bee eye, for example, is an amazing thing. It's made up of lots and lots of individual little facets. So they don't see the world as we do, but they do see further into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum than we can. And so it's very well known, I'm sure all of you are aware, that if you photograph many flowers like this creeping sankfoil on the right-hand side, which is an incredibly common weed actually in many people's gardens, but you can see under UV light that there are lines and a landing platform directing any pollinating insects to come into the middle of this flower, which is where they'll find the pollen or the nectar or both. And you can see it with the crane's-bill on the left-hand side as well. Those white lines would be shining out under ultraviolet that the bee can see in, that this is where the goodies are. And we've talked about the scent as well. So unfortunately, plants don't create scents for us, or they didn't originally. They're all about creating smells which will attract different types of pollinators to them. And again, this is the sort of chemistry of some of these things, just to show you that there's different compounds involved in different groups of flowers, which have all evolved to attract insects in different ways. So if you've been out recently, you'll have seen the hawthorn bushes in flower, I'm sure, the white May blossom everywhere. And I'm wondering how many of you actually like the smell of hawthorn, or whether you don't like it. But there's an old folk tale that says you should never cut and bring hawthorn in the house. And the reason is that it's supposed to smell quite close to decaying flesh. So maybe we don't get exposed to dead bodies as much as we used to hundreds of years ago, but so we don't recognize that. But it's evolved that sort of smell because it's attracting insects which would be attracted to dead bodies, to dead animals. And then they'd arrive and they'd suck up the nectar, eat the pollen, and they'd act as pollinators. So I quite like the smell. It always reminds me of the best time of year in my view, but not everybody likes the smell of hawthorn for that reason. And there are some more less obvious ways that plants and pollinators are actually interacting. And this is one of the electrical fields. So there's this positive charge that is carried on the and the outside skeleton, the exoskeleton of many insects, and the flowers have a negative charge, and that's been known for quite a while, where it's assumed that that therefore helps the pollen stick to the pollinators, that sort of electrical field that's generated. That's been known about in bees, but now it's been found out that other insects have this ability as well. It's quite, again, subtle what's going on. So you have this instance mentioned here in this piece here, where when a pollinator comes in and takes away the pollen, then the plant may lose the negative charge. So the pollinator that comes along can tell by the electrical charge that moves the sensory bristles and hairs on it, whether or not there's pollen there to be taken. So it's a signal to don't waste your time here, the pollen's already gone. Fascinating that this sort of interaction is going on at that sort of level. So if you want to find out more about that, you'll find out more, I'm sure, on the web. But it also is similar to what happens, say, in some flowers. So the common forget-me-not, if you've grown that in your garden with lovely little blue flowers with a yellow center, when the pollen has been removed, the yellow center turns white. And that again is a visual signal to other pollinators that there's no pollen left. So don't bother coming here to collect it. So there's lots of subtlety going on. And another subtle thing is that's been discovered, this is the University of Bristol research here, is that if you use a thermal camera to look at flowers, often flowers are cupped, of course, and they can actually create much higher temperatures in the center of their flowers by the reflection of sunlight. And so sometimes you find bees, when the clouds come over and the temperature drops suddenly, they will sit in the center of flowers where they're nice and warm. Insects are very temperature dependent creatures, and they will be able to keep active, but staying in the one place until it warms up again. And this also means that on a cold day in the spring, that a bumblebee queen that's emerged from hibernation might actually, in the middle of a flower, be a lot warmer than you might imagine when we're shivering in the spring sunshine. So lots of subtlety in what's going on. So I don't know if everyone's got a piece of paper or whether you want to play this little game, but before we have a 10-minute break, just thought I'd show you a few pictures and see if you'd like to try and put a name to them, and we'll have the answers when we come back after the break. But here are A to F of some of our local insects that are great pollinators. I'm not expecting you to put Latin names onto them or even specific English names, but you might be able to say one's a butterfly and one's a bee or whatever it might be. But if you want to have a quick go at that, to have a go now, and I'm going to show you a second set as well. So I don't know whether everyone's had a chance to have a go at that. I have sprung it on you. I'm going to show you the second lot now as well. So there's another 6 images here. And again, these might be a bit more tricky, but just have a think about what type of insect they are from what we've heard about so far. And then we'll stop for a 10-minute break and chance to get a cup of tea, go to the loo, and then I'll give you the answers, see how you go on.
Thanks, Ray. Okay, so we meet back at 19, should we say 23?
Very precise. Let's do that.
I know that some people don't really need a break, but now that we've got a quiz, maybe we actually do. Can we have the pictures back up, please, Ray?
Yeah, there's the first one.
Are they supposed to be intentionally tricky, like confusing that they're bees when they're wasps, that kind of thing?
All will be revealed.
They're so tricky.
I mean, what I haven't mentioned, of course, but I have said that the honeybees and the bees will have 4 wings, 2 pairs of wings, and true flies will only have 1 pair of wings, but you can't always see that very clearly, can you?
No. Say that again. So flies have 1 pair of wings, bees have 2 pairs
2
of
pairs
wings,
of wings, yes.
like
Yeah.
dragonflies.
Yes. And what is actually more efficient to have 1 pair of wings. So many, flies are most fantastic flyers, and they are flies. They can go backwards, upside down, and all sorts of things. And they've only got this 1 pair of wings. And many other groups of insects with 4 wings have developed ways of trying to link each pair of wings together on one side. So with bees, on the front edge of the back wing, there are lots of little hooks, and they can hook on to the back edge of the forewing, and then
Wow.
that side of that wing beats as one, which is totally different to dragonflies, where on one side of the body the 2 wings beat in different ways. They don't connect at all. And even in butterflies and moths, in many moths, they have a big spike that comes out from the base of the hind wing underneath, and there's a little catch it hooks onto, and that means that, again, when they're flying, one side, the 2 wings are joined together and act as one plane.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Mo said, can we go back to the first slide for 5 minutes? I think we're on the first
This is
slide.
the first one. Should we go back to the other one?
Should we go to the other one? Hopefully that's what she means.
This is the second slide.
Okay. Right, don't forget to have a break, everyone. I'm just going to get some water. So we'll be back at 1923. I'll be really interested to hear if anyone's confident on this. I am very unconfident. Shall we ask people if they know, or are you just going to tell them?
Yeah, I think we should.
Yeah?
Shall we kick off again?
Yeah. Oh, Luke's confident about K.
Gave you the answers then. Okay, let's go with the first slide. Anybody want to shout out what A is?
That's a hummingbird moth.
It is hummingbird hawk moth. So that's a fantastic thing. The second one, B. Anyone recognise that?
Nope.
Right, this is the dark-edged bee fly. So this is the one that rests with its cheating with its feet on the flower. So it's a proper fly. And the C.
I thought that was a honeybee.
It certainly is. Well done. D. I'm sure most people will recognise what one of those is. Generic terms.
Wasp.
Just a social wasp, yeah. E.
Tortoiseshell.
Close, very close. It's actually a painted lady butterfly, that one. And then F.
White-tailed.
It is a bumblebee, but actually this is a tree bumblebee. And the second set, how about G? It's another honeybee. That's a honeybee. If you look, it's got long antennae coming down into the flower here. And these really look quite elongate eyes, whereas hoverflies have very short antennae. H.
Sorry, what was G?
G is a honeybee.
It is. Oh.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then H. Does anybody recognise the flower it's on?
Is it lungwort?
Oh, I knew that
is.
one.
It is lungwort.
Oh, sorry. I beat you to it, sorry.
So lungwort is a spring flower, Pollinators, and this is one of the spring bees. It's a solitary bee called the wonderful name of the hairy-footed flower bee. And then I, just a general name.
Bumblebee.
That's a bumblebee, yeah. And J,
Some sort of bee.
that's another bumblebee. And K,
No idea.
that's one of the,
Fly.
it's a hoverfly. Very short little antennae just there. So that's one of the dragonflies that pretends to be a honeybee. And then the last one looks very much like a honeybee, but this is, I don't know if you recognize the flower again there, that's ivy. And this is a solitary bee you see in September on the ivy flowers in the autumn, called the ivy mining bee.
I was going to say a mining bee. That's the only one I thought. Yay!
Big tick. There we go. Right, so just to refresh, there's the actual names of them. And so I'm going to talk about bees now, which is probably what you thought you're going to hear about all the time. But again, there's quite a bit of confusion around bees. So hopefully, if anyone is confused, I can help. So the honeybee, here it is. This is the bee that if it stings, the sting gets ripped out and the bee dies. This is the only bee where that happens. So if a bumblebee stings you, it can sting you again and again and again. So this is the one where the sting gets pulled out of the body because it has the little hooks on it. There's a lot of debate as to whether honeybees are actually native bees to the British Isles, or whether they've always been domesticated. So if you think about it, the honeybee is also unique in that the way it spends the winter is as a big colony, and that's why it makes honey. to feed all the worker bees during the winter. This is the only bee you'll find in the UK that overwinters in this way. Everything else either overwinters as an egg, or as a grub, or as a sort of chrysalis, or as the queen bee. So things like bumblebees, everybody dies off. All the worker bees die, the males that come out to make the new queens die, and you're just left with mated queens. And they go and find a little mouse hole somewhere inside of a bank and will spend the winter there, come out in the spring, which is when you see these huge bumblebees buzzing around, and they start a new nest. Whereas the honeybee has got workers going all the way through the winter. And there's been a lot of controversy recently about whether people have got the wrong end of the stick when they think that pollinators are in trouble. But the answer to that is to have lots more beehives, because the beehives are artificial, they're run by people. Some honeybees can live in the wild, but they don't tend to last particularly long. So most of the honeybees you see will be coming from a hive with a honeybee, with a beekeeper. And it has been suggested that actually, that if people keep lots and lots of honeybees, they will outcompete and take away the pollen and nectar that our native solitary bees need. So been stuff in the press just last week about it, which you might have picked up on. And some people would say that if you think that there's a problem with pollinators, therefore we should have lots more hives everywhere with honeybees in, that would be the equivalent of saying lots of birds have died from bird flu, but it's all right because we're going to put lots of chicken farms around the country because they're domesticated birds and the honeybee is a domesticated insect. So something to think about. Anyway, our wild native bees, we have just under 30 types of bumblebee, but a lot of them are getting much rarer. They are characteristic shape. Sorry, was there a question? No?
Sorry, no.
All right. So I'm showing you a picture of their mouth parts because that's quite important, because they are specialized in some ways for collecting nectar, and they will suck up the nectar and they'll mix it with the pollen and then put the pollen on their pollen baskets on their hind legs, like in the picture on the left, and take it back to their nest. And there's only probably about half a dozen types of bumblebee that you'll find locally now. And here are some of them. So the garden bumblebee and the common carder bee, which is a very rusty brown one. They're what we call long-tongued bees. So they've got a long tongue so they can get into some of the flowers that have a long tube. The early bumblebee, which is the one you'll see sometimes all the way through the winter, appearing, is the one with a medium-sized tongue. And then we have white-tailed and buff-tailed bees, and we have red-tailed bees. So those are the common ones you'd probably see. They're not, the white and the buff-tailed ones can look incredibly like each other, so they're not easy to tell apart. And it's recently been discovered that the white-tailed bee is actually 3 different species across the UK, but they look so incredibly alike that you can't tell them apart really by just looking at them externally. Whereas something like the red-tailed bee is very easy. These bees with short tongues are famous for having evolved and developed a way of cheating the flower by making a hole in the long tubed flowers so they can stick their short tongues in and get the nectar, and that way they bypass getting pollen on them. So they're not good for the plant. Pollination probably won't happen if they are nectar robbing, as it's called. Most bumblebees will live in small colonies. So honeybees are thousands of bees. Little bumblebee nests, probably a couple of hundred bees at most usually. And some in holes in the ground, some up in the air. But we do have this bee that arrived with us about 20 years ago, naturally colonized the UK from Europe, called a tree bumblebee. and it has this white bottom, but it's got this gingery thorax, and it doesn't have other bands, so it's quite easy to tell apart. It's common in people's gardens now in Bristol, and it will nest, as its name might give you a clue, in holes in trees, but will also use bird boxes. And I've certainly had nests in my roof space in my house in Bristol. So that's an easy one to look out for as well. And then we have the solitary bees. So these are ones that don't live in big nests, all of the same sort. They tend to dig little holes and provision those holes again with pollen and nectar for their grubs to eat as they grow up. And that's where the ivy mining bee is one of those, for example, and the little one that looks like a tiny bumblebee, that hairy-footed flower bee you see in the spring. And if you plant Pollinators, lungwort, I'm just about guarantee you'll get these bees visiting in the spring. Oh no, they love lungwort. But solitary bees don't tend to have those flower baskets on their hind legs. They tend to be able to collect pollen on the underside of their bodies in special hairs and take them back to their little tunnels. And here are some tunnels. You might have seen these in your lawn if you've got one. The tawny mining bee makes these little holes in your lawn, and it's this lovely orangey coloured bee, and will go down in the hole and lay an egg, put some pollen and nectar in there, and then its grub will hatch and survive in this little tunnel, which is all sealed up until the next year. And the other one, well, there's also ones that do that in masonry, of course. Masonry bees are quite famous. And the other one at the bottom there is very famous. If you've particularly if you've got roses, you might have seen these wonderful circles, semicircles cut out of your leaves. That's caused by the leafcutter bees. And quite often, if you're growing plants in plastic plant pots, you might find they've actually gone up underneath if they're on a slatted surface and are making holes in the base of your plant pot. Little tunnels provisioned with these leaves and some pollen, which is where their grubs will grow up. So there's about 250 types of these in the country. So those are a run through lots of pollinating insects in and around Bristol. The question is, how well are they doing? And it's not great news, I'm afraid. So we don't have very good sets of data where you can prove what's happening out in the wild. But the types of pollinators that are most well recorded in the country are butterflies and moths. And Butterfly Conservation Society publishes these reports. So this one for last year about butterflies, as you can see, suggested 80% of British butterflies in the UK, British butterfly species, have decreased since the 1970s. And with moths, it's a similar sort of situation. So a third of the number of moths that we had 50 years ago no longer are found in the UK. That's a drop in abundance of that much, which is really quite worrying. This little one on the left, the little mint moth, you probably find in your garden quite regularly. The other bits of information we have, so this is a bit of research that went on back in 2004. The RSPB did this promotion where they were trying to get people to count the number of dead bugs on your registration plate on your car, and that's been redone in the southeast of England by Bug Life, the charity, in 2021, and they showed that between 2004 and 2021, over half of the abundance of insects have dropped by over a half, which is really, again, quite concerning. So insects as a whole, many of these pollinators seem to be in decline. And what are the causes for that? And you can postulate lots of different things. So we all like to put up bird boxes, but actually the more bird boxes you put up, the higher the concentration of birds. So maybe they're eating lots more insects and their grubs and reducing the number of pollinators. I don't really think that's to blame. But those nocturnal pollinators, it's now been shown that light pollution is impacting upon moths and other night-flying insects' ability to reproduce, not only in terms of distracting them while they're flying about as adults, but the caterpillars and grubs that will be living in the bushes and grass underneath lights will also be affected, not be so successful if they don't have a period of darkness when they can feed in the dark without being worried about being predated. And of course, the really big one is climate change, which we all know about. So we are seeing big changes in our insect life as a consequence of what's happening, and certain lifestyles, if you like, of different insects are being impacted in different ways. So those which have caterpillars overwintering are perhaps being most affected. And the climatic extremes we're seeing, and we have seen, so that real heat wave last year would have meant that many insects wouldn't find the vegetation in the right condition for them to be able to survive on it. And then we've had a really cold, wet spring. And this spring, lots of insect people are saying just how concerned they are about how few insects there are about. Things like bumblebees, not as common as we'd normally expect them to be, even with the declines that have been taking place. So it's very concerning, actually, what's going on. One impact that's perhaps not very well known about is this thing called eutrophication. You might have heard that term mentioned about with the rivers, the state of our rivers, whereby you put lots of organic matter into a river like sewage, it becomes eutrophic, it's too fertile, and you get these algal blooms. Well, the same thing happens with our terrestrial habitats, but it's less obvious. So there's so much nitrogen now in our air that comes out and lands on the leaves of plants, that many plants are actually growing more vigorously than they would have done previously. And little things like this pearl-bordered fritillary butterfly, which is now very rare, it has this little black caterpillar that eats violets on the floor of woodland rides. And it's black so it can absorb sun's heat. But as the foliage has been growing more rapidly in more recent years, it's not getting warm enough to actually complete its life cycle. So this is, excuse me, one reason why many insects are dying out as well, that the plant growth is more vigorous. But probably the biggest concern is about the amount of pesticides that are used in our countryside and our farms. I know farmers are very sensitive about this, and at a time when we see the price of food shooting up and food security being a real issue, there's a horrible balance here between having efficient farming but trying not to poison our land and poison all our pollinators. At the end of the day, it's in all our benefits if we don't kill off our pollinators. And some of those pesticides have made the national headlines, and there's this horrible chemical called neonicotinoids, and Europe banned the use of these chemicals when it was noticed how deadly they were in tiny concentrations to many of our pollinating insects like bees. But the UK, since it came out of Europe, has now been allowing some use of neonicotinoids, for example, on sugar beet in the south, in the East Anglian area. But also people don't realise that the flea and tick treatments that you put on the outside of your dog or cat, the little drops, are this same chemical. And when they go for a walk in the water, like this dog is, that chemical can come off and kill lots of insects. So the way to get around that is to go to your vet and get an internal treatment that can be added to the dog food. And that way you won't be poisoning our watercourses without realising it. And habitat destruction. So although we still have a green and pleasant land, most of it seems to be, much of it gets built on, and much of it is now pretty dead because of all the pesticides on it. So real cause for concern. So what can we do? Let's have a positive aspect on it. 87% of households have a garden. There could be 23 million gardens in the UK. All of us can do something to help our pollinators. And in fact, University of Bristol research has shown that gardens are really rich places, urban gardens, for pollinators. So we can make a real contribution here. And this is where thinking more about your pollinators can help. So it's not just about planting the right types of plants. You do obviously want to provide pollen and nectar-rich plants, but you want to think about them being spread across the year, as I said earlier. But you also want to think about where are your pollinators going to breed. So those hoverflies with their rat-tailed maggots, if you can have a little bit of a wet area where they can live as the grubs, you'll have the pollinating hoverflies in the spring. And you leave a bit of dead wood around where pollinators can hide over winter. That mosaic of habitats we talked about. And most importantly, don't use chemicals in your garden. And here's an example of where an old bird box has been used by bumblebees. So you have to think about the different layers in a garden as well. There's the ground level, there's a foot or two above that, and then there's right up through trees and bushes. So do think about all the different habitats. Think of yourself as a centimetre long, and then you realise what a huge space a garden is and how many different habitats there are within it. You can have these little bee hotels, like in the picture in the bottom right. They're quite a good thing to do. Water is really good, dead wood, as I've said. There's a picture of a rat-tailed maggot. So,
someone asked, I think I forgot to ask you, but someone asked, they've got a bug hotel. Do they have to clean it out?
You don't have to. It's an idea to, but actually I don't tend to. You might find that you get quite a few bees in the first year or two, and then it might drop off a bit. And that's partly thought to be because some of the predators and parasites get to spot them. It's much easier if you're a predator or a parasite to find bees in a bee hotel stuck on a wall than it is to search through dead bramble stems and find the natural places. So there may be a balance that's created. And actually, one of the tests of a very strong, healthy ecosystem is that there are lots of predators and parasites. So don't worry about parasites. We shouldn't be stomping on them and killing them. It's good that we have them. But that's one of the concerns about bee hotels, is that it's a little bit obvious. So if you can disguise them, get foliage around them as well, that will help probably. So here are some suggestions for a few plants about that, that produce lots of good pollen and stuff. You don't have to stick to native plants. It helps if you can do, but there are lots of good things like buddleia, of course, which comes from the Himalaya. Is a very good nectar producer and pollen producer. So a few suggestions there, possible plants. The thing to avoid are these really fancy things like double-headed roses, because they just have been bred so that they don't have nectar or pollen. So they might look pretty, but they're useless in terms of helping our pollinators. And the thing I'd recommend is you go out to Grow Wilder in Frenchay, the Avon Wildlife Trust place, so you can pick up native wildflowers there. You can learn more about what are the good plants to put in your garden. And if you're not familiar with Team Wilder in the Avon Wildlife Trust, you can, again, take action there. You can upload your action on the WECA website to actually commit to, say, not using pesticides in your garden. And I was wondering if you had suggestions yourselves to tell each other about different plants, but we can come back to that in a minute. So just to reinforce the message finally about the different mosaics in your garden, and even pots of plants, even on a balcony, you can make a difference. And when people talk about wildlife gardening, they always talk about growing nettles for some reason. Nettles are one of the flowering plants that are wind pollinated. They are caterpillar food for certain butterflies, but even foreign plants like fuchsia, which is not a native plant, of course, the caterpillars of our elephant hawk moth have adapted to feed on that. They come out at night and eat your fuchsia leaves. And then, in the wild, they would normally eat willow herb, but they love fuchsias. or bog bean if you grow that in a pond. And then you get these amazing great big moths in June flying about at night, pollinating your plants. And you can end up with really beautiful things like this. This is in Bristol. What a wonderful sight to see. Gladdens the heart of anybody passing by. And my final slide is a bit off the wall slightly, but this is, as it says, fringe research. So it's not exactly got full scientific backing behind it, but there's this piece of research, this person in Arizona who is suggesting that bees can demonstrate sophisticated emotions resembling optimism, frustration, playfulness, and fear, traits more commonly associated with mammals. So if that helps us think about insects more in a friendly way, I'm all for it, because they do need friends. And if we think twice about swatting a fly because we've thought it might be showing fear, good for us. So I'm going to finish there, and got a bit of time for any further questions if anybody wanted to ask anything. Or were there any more questions in the chat?
Yes, there was one. Mo was wondering, is there a campaign about asking your neighbours to angle the security light down or even switch them off? I guess it's the same with like street lights. Is there a campaign about that? Do you know, Ray?
I don't know about one locally. I mean, there's the National Dark Skies Initiative, isn't there, which does try and persuade people and councils to turn the lights down. And also, street lights have been changing over to LED lighting, and that's still pretty bad for nocturnal pollinators, but you can just add a filter onto it that cuts out the UV bit, and that reduces their impact on night in-flying insects. So I don't know whether our local councils are doing that, but they ought to be.
Okay, so maybe we could be writing to them, suggesting that. Yeah. Amy, was your question answered about what, with the expected heat wave, what you can do on a budget and with the disability to help animals, insects, pollinators in my garden?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
There was the mention of the small blue butterflies just then. The little blue butterflies you're seeing in your gardens at the moment are the holly blue butterfly, which tends to actually fly around and settle on leaves where it will suck up the honeydew, the sticky secretions from greenfly and aphids. So it doesn't do a lot of pollinating of flowers, but it's a brilliant thing to see. It's lovely to see it. And it will be laying its eggs now into the buds of holly flowers. And then in the autumn, when the next generation emerges, lays its eggs into the flowers of ivy. So it has two different flowers. There is a British butterfly called the small blue, and that's much more localized. There's a few sites in Bristol where it occurs, but that has to have kidney veg flowers for its caterpillars to eat. And they only tend to grow on grassland, limey grassland that's not been improved. So that's why the butterfly is much more rarer than the holly blue. Well, they're coming in now. What preys on tree bumblebees? Tree bumblebees are one of a couple of bumblebees that have two nests during the year. So you'll have a nest at the moment from the queen tree bumblebee that's come out of hibernation. But by the end of June, they will have produced males and females, new queens, mated and flown off, and the old nest will die out, and they'll start a second nest. And most bees will just have one nest in the year, but that particular bee will have two. So it may be that it naturally died off in the summer, or it could be that it was found by some birds. So you sometimes find little piles of dead bumblebees, or and if you look carefully, they've been very carefully had their insides taken out, and that's usually great tits. So they'll find a spot where the birds are coming in and out, where the bees are coming in and out of the nest, and they'll catch them, and they've worked out a way of not getting stung, but they will eat the insides of the bee and then drop the husk below. So there are bees that will also predate on, birds that will predate on bees and avoid being stung. Anything else I can answer?
Any other questions, guys? Now's your chance.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
On some other training I've done, they're saying on a positive note that insects are one of the first creatures that can actually recover quickly because of their lifespan. You know.
Yep, that's absolutely true. And you may have heard about the NEP site over in Sussex, which has been rewilded, and that's really demonstrated it. And the butterfly that everybody tends to think is quite rare, the purple emperor, this really big, beautiful blue butterfly, has come back in huge numbers there comparatively, and that just demonstrates the insects, as you say, most have an annual life cycle. So not only do they demonstrate quickly what's happening if it's bad, like at the moment, but if they're given the chance to come back again quickly, they will recover. So we just need to give them that chance, really.
Thank you.
I had a
Yeah,
question.
I've just put a link to the book. Is it called Rewilding or Wilding? The one by Isabella Treat, Wilding, and
That's
yeah,
the
that's
new
all
one.
about that's all about NEP, and it's yeah, you'll all love it. I promise. It's so good, so well written, really easy to read, because sometimes they're a bit dense, aren't they, these natural history books, but that one is really, really easy to read.
It
I
is
promise.
great. She's just produced a new one. That might be it. So there's the original one called Rewilding, and then there's the new one. I
Yeah.
haven't read yet, but yeah, great.
Yeah,
great.
that one's a bit thick, isn't it? It looks more like a textbook on how to do rewilding.
That's it.
Oh, Melissa was there for 2 weeks last summer. Oh my God,
Whoa,
jealous.
fantastic.
I was there a few years ago, and there was like flocks of goldfinches, like 30 or 40 goldfinch flocks, which I'd never seen before. Normally when you see a goldfinch, you see like 4 max, right?
Well, yeah, that's
Amazing.
interesting as well, because finches, of course, are known as seed-eating birds, but they still feed their nestlings on insects, soft caterpillars. So they still need to have lots of pollinating insects around in their different stages in order to be successful. So, you know, you have to think about the complexity of all these interactions that are going on.
Yeah. And like what Rosa was saying in the wildlife gardening course 2 weeks ago, she was saying things like aphids, you think they're a pest, but actually the food of many of the beneficial insects, the pollinators that we want in our gardens. So you just have to accept what you get.
Yeah, and you just have to be patient, don't you? Because if there's lots of aphids, then the ladybirds will come in. There'll be a little bit of a lag before they come in to eat them, and the lacewings will eat them. But just a bit of patience, and they should bring them down to manageable levels.
Yeah.
I had a question, Ray. Is there sort of some science research that shows whether some plants replenish their pollen more quickly than others?
Yes, actually, there's a great new book out as well. I was going to mention books briefly, but this has just been published. This book called Solitary Bees, and there's quite a lot of information in there about plants as well as the bees themselves, showing how that it's even more complex, that many flowers will be replenishing their nectar and pollen supplies at different rates, depending on what they want to do, if you like. I know you shouldn't talk about animals and plants having, you know, brains like we have, but in effect it's happening that a plant will, if it's saying it's not got any pollen left, it's waiting to be, hopefully it's been fertilized, so it's going to move on to the next stage. But if the seed hasn't been fertilized, then it will be creating more pollen, more nectar to attract more pollinators along to make it happen more. And there's so many different variations between different types of flowers. You know, the different families of flowers have these different shaped flowers. So a dead nettle, you know, it's got this little top on it, very different to an open flower. So they're all very closely connected to different insects acting as pollinators and different strategies. Some pollen is actually toxic to some insects as well, so you don't want to get the wrong pollen if you're a particular type of insect, because you won't like it. If you want a general guide to insects, there is this is an old copy, but there's the books by Paul Brock. Fantastic, full of wonderful photographs of all the types of insects you might find. So get one of those, I would recommend it.
Sorry, what was that book again?
A Comprehensive Guide to Insects of Great Britain and Ireland by Paul Brock.
Thank you.
I think it's on the 3rd edition, so mine's the 2nd edition. It's got a different insect on the front now, but fantastic book, really good.
I'll pop a link in the chat. I might get that one.
That's it.
That's really good. Amy's got a good quote here. The creature at your feet, demised as a bug or a weed, is a creation in and of itself. It has a name, a millionaire history, and a place in the world. Very true.
Many millions, yeah.
Yeah, many. It's too big to think about. Oh my God, Ray, thank you so much. That was like going back to school in the best possible way. I've learned so I've learned so much.
Thank
It
you,
was so-
Ray.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Well, good luck with everything. All that gardening.
Yeah. Thank you. And next week we've got Gardens at Night, everyone. So we'll be learning all about, probably more about our nighttime pollinators. So yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. What a session.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you,
for
everyone.
having
Thanks,
me.
Ray.
Cheers.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Right, let me stop the recording.